We are live now. Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the first Shakespeare lecture of Department of English, Deshbandhu College. Now Shakespeare is almost 460 years old, and now we are still holding him in high esteem and great regard. And we wanted to have this occasion to celebrate, and we wanted to have Professor of English Jonathan Gill Harris with us to deliver a lecture on a relevant topic, and he so rightly picked up Shakespeare and its connection to pandemic. Now, before we go on to have a discussion on this, let's have an idea about the current situation, right? The current situation is here, well, so difficult for us to manage that it's almost intolerable for us to go through the times, but still all of us are trying our best to make it happen. Just to give a short introduction to today's distinguished speaker, Jonathan Gill Harris is a professor of English and the founding dean of academic affairs at Ashoka University. Until 2013, he was a professor of English at George Washington University and associate editor of Shakespeare Quarterly. The author of many books on Shakespeare, including Untimely Matter in the Time of Shakespeare, Shakespeare and the Literary Theory, Masala Shakespeare. Harris is also a scholar of medical history, having published two books, Foreign Bodies and the Body Politic, and Sick Economics, on epidemic disease and its impact on political thought, economic thought, and drama. He's best known in India as the author of the bestseller, The First Firangis. He was the president of the Shakespeare Society of India from 2014 onwards. So we formally welcome Professor Harris to our online platform, to the Department of English, Deshbandhu College. And we welcome you, sir. The platform is yours to deliver your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shashwato, and thank you to Deshbandhu College for inviting me. I know the topic for today is not what we'd expect at a birthday party, but we also have to acknowledge that now is a time in which every birthday is one that is accompanied by this constant lurking reality that reminds us that life is much more tenuous than we often assume it to be. And rather than dance around that, or rather than pretend that everything is all okay, I think it's best to mark Shakespeare by recognizing the affinity, the solidarity that he might feel with us right now. And how Shakespeare responded to pandemic in his own moment, I think can be quite instructive for us. I've got a PowerPoint presentation here, so just bear with me for a second while I get it up on screen for you. I am often a little bit slow in getting these up and running, which is a sign of my advancing years. But in any case, here is the first slide. So Shakespeare was no stranger to pandemic. It shaped his thinking, it shaped his language, it shaped his career in ways that might seem uncannily familiar to us here in India. So picture this. An epidemic is ravaging the capital. Healthy people are falling ill with fever, aches, dry coughs. Many die within a matter of days. Fear grips the city. A migrant worker, one of many in a city swollen by people desperate for economic opportunity, faces a difficult decision. His livelihood has disappeared overnight. The place where he works, located in a poor informal settlement in the city's northeast, has shut down, and his company has disbanded. he has to find another source of income, and that means walking back to his village about 60 kilometers from the city, or finding employment elsewhere in the countryside, far away from the outbreak. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? You might think, hearing these words, that I'm talking about the plight of a Delhi laborer in 2020 or 2021. But I'm actually talking about William Shakespeare, who was a migrant to London from his village of Stratford in the year 1592. In August that year, London witnessed its most horrific outbreak of bubonic plague. It had endured many such outbreaks before, but this was the worst in over a century. Now, we know now that the disease was conveyed by black rats carrying infectious bacteria. But before the invention of the microscope and the discovery of microorganisms, plague was attributed to other causes. It was often attributed to bad air, what was known as miasma. More disturbingly, the cause of plague was often believed to be malevolent Jews who were believed to poison the wells from which Christians drew their drinking water. Plague was also explained as the result of the will of an angry God intent on punishing sinners. Now, for those who contracted it, the disease was pretty much a death sentence. Around 20,000 people in London, which by some people's reckoning is a fifth of the population of the city, would die by the end of 1593. So you can imagine how utterly this transformed living in London. This is an image of the effect of the plague on London at this time. And so you can see here on the right, people fleeing the city, but they're also fleeing a figure, a skeleton, holding an arrow, which is pointed at them. Above London is a cloud with what looks a bit like a banana peel, but it's in fact lightning striking. And we can see on the left, people struggling with the disease and dying. I follow, we fly. The we fly are the residents escaping the city. I follow is death. This gives some indication of how utterly plague had come to dominate the imaginations of people at this time. Now, that's not Shakespeare, that's Ralph Fiennes in the film Shakespeare in Love. But Shakespeare in Love depicts the young Shakespeare when he was a struggling playwright, before he had become Shakespeare, and he was just a man suffering from writer's block. It's nice to think that the young Shakespeare had to struggle only with writer's block. The film left out the fact that Shakespeare's biggest struggle as a young playwright was plague. And maybe that's because in 1999, when the film was made, we didn't have quite the same sense of imminent danger from disease. Yes, there would be talks every now and then about epidemics like the swine flu or the avian flu, but these were always sort of distant thoughts. They weren't clear and present dangers and realities. Now, in 1592, the young Shakespeare was a journeyman playwright and actor. His career up to this point hadn't been particularly distinguished, or one presumes lucrative. And it was certainly not reputable. London's Puritan leaders, they were in many ways Christian fundamentalists, Protestant fundamentalists. They regarded the theatre as a den of sin, provoking God's wrath by making boy actors impersonate women and poor players impersonate kings. And many of these Puritans said, you know what the cause of plague is? The sin of the theatre. As a result, they ordered the closure of the playhouses, not because they had a strong understanding of contagion and thought, well, at a theatre, there's no social distancing, people might spread the disease, and they were right about that. It was simply because they couldn't bear the idea that boys were dressing up as women and poor people were dressing up as kings. They thought this was the ultimate in sin, and this is what was causing plague. Now, one of the theatres that was closed down, you can see in this map at the top right, it was called The Theatre. And The Theatre, it's in London's northeast suburbs. This is where Shakespeare's early plays were performed. The theatre wouldn't open again for 2 years after this. So this was a huge crisis for Shakespeare and his fellow actors. Imagine losing your job for 2 years. We now had the benefit of hindsight, and we can say, oh yes, but yet later Shakespeare would come back and enjoy a long and storied career, even a lucrative career. But just put yourself in Shakespeare's shoes, a struggling young playwright in 1592. Your place of work is closed down. Your city is ravaged by pandemic. The future must have looked very, very frightening indeed. Now, London's response to the plague was basically panic, paralysis, an exodus of migrant labor, a pandemic of blame, and closure of theatres. All this might seem uncannily familiar to us now in COVID-era Delhi, or Bombay for that matter. Even the muddied thinking about the origins of disease might ring some bells. In times of pandemic disease, there's often a compulsion to blame people for spreading the disease. Scapegoats get found and called out, and violence is committed against them. Even the rush to demonize the nation's entertainment industry might sound familiar to us. So, in other words, we can see that London had its own version of the Tablighi outrage, where Muslims were unfairly accused of being the sources, the vectors of COVID, threatening the lives of everyone else. Jews played that role in London at the time. And the Riya Chakravarti hysteria got played out again in relation to actors who were seen as sources of moral corruption that needed to be stamped out in order to make society just and good for the majority. Now, fortunately, Shakespeare didn't respond to the pandemic in either of these ways. We know very little about Shakespeare's early life, least of all his first years in London. As far as we know, he probably moved to London in about 1588 or 1589 when he was just 24. And he moved presumably to become an actor, not a playwright. But we do know that for nearly 2 years after the pandemic struck, he didn't write for the stage. Instead, he turned his hand to poetry. During the lockdown of the theatres, he published 2 long poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. Both were clearly written by someone who had pandemic disease on his mind. Lucrece's rapist, Tarquin, is compared not once but twice to a public plague. And Venus tells Adonis, the object of her unrequited passion, "The plague is banished by thy breath," she wishes. I wish that everyone we fell in love with could just exhale and make COVID go away. Indeed, Venus and Adonis is less a celebration of erotic love in the style of Shakespeare's source text, Ovid's Metamorphoses, than it is an extended lament about the shock of epidemic disease. Venus spends the last part of the poem, after Adonis has been killed by a wild boar, chiding death. And this is what she says. Grim, grinning ghost, earth's worm, what dost thou mean to stifle beauty and to steal his breath, who when he lived, his breath and beauty set gloss on the rose? The image of a rose and its loss glances back to the poem's very first reference to Adonis, who Shakespeare describes as rose-cheeked Adonis. And flowers haunt the entire poem as shorthand for Adonis, the object of Venus's desire. A long disquisition on love in a new era of sudden death evokes an image of a destroyed flower that once again evokes Adonis. But this flower suggests not the goring that Adonis has experienced courtesy of the boar, but a blighted infection reminiscent of the plague. It shall be fickle, false, full of fraud, bud and be blasted in a breathing while. What an eerily uncanny image for us now, where all it takes is one breath, one quick moment of exhalation, to blast, meaning to blight a rose and transform it from something healthy into something sick. Clearly, this is an image inspired by the plague, but it resonates for us in this age of COVID and our fear of respiratory illness. Love, Venus says, is a bud, a rose that stands to be blasted or blighted, struck down by disease in the instant of a breath. In this, she echoes what she'd earlier said to Adonis, trying unsuccessfully to persuade him to make love to her so he can produce an heir. It's a rather strange come on line. Come on, love me. Make love to me. That way, I'll get pregnant and I'll produce an heir for you who will outlive you, she says. Even here, the poem is thinking about erotic love, not in terms of passion, but in terms of insurance against death. You might die at any moment. Please produce a child. And again, she compares Adonis to a flower. She says, beauty within itself should not be wasted. Fair flowers that are not gathered in their prime rot and consume themselves in little time. Rotting, consuming. These were verbs repeatedly associated with the effects of the plague, which rotted people's flesh, consumed their lungs, making it impossible for them to breathe. Now, in a way, these are standard images of metamorphosis that Shakespeare had imbibed from Ovid. I always said Shakespeare had a massive man crush on Ovid. He clearly had studied Ovid extremely closely, even as a grammar school boy. And I suspect as a playwright, he pretty much went to sleep every night with a copy of the Metamorphoses under his pillow. But there's a difference between Venus and Adonis and Ovid's Metamorphoses. Even though Venus and Adonis was influenced by Ovid, the idea of transformation that we find in Shakespeare's poem is a much more traumatic one that seems to be the result of living with pandemic and the frightening transformation of health into illness and death in the space of a few days. In the context of the plague pandemic, it's hard not to see the prospect of wasting, rotting, consuming fair flowers, as Shakespeare adapting classical convention to express a new emotional reality, a horror at the sudden omnipresence of death, striking down youth capaciously, capriciously, and with no warning. Now, Venus and Adonis was written by a poet who also seemed to have internalized some, if not all, some of the anti-theatrical attitude of the Puritan leaders who had closed the playhouses. Shakespeare evidently believed that his early plays, which at this point included a few masala comedies about separated brothers and the travails of love, the Comedy of Errors and the Two Gentlemen of Verona, some history plays about England's medieval kings, Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and a gruesome, violent tragedy in which a character is turned into a meat pie and served as dinner to his mother, Titus Andronicus. Shakespeare seems to have believed all of these were insignificant and frivolous. Now, why do I say that? In a letter that accompanied the first edition of Venus and Adonis, Shakespeare called the poem the first heir of my invention. You can see it there at the bottom of the page. The first heir of my invention, as if he's saying, this is my first literary child. All that stuff I wrote for theatre, that's just B-grade claptrap. Now at last I've written something real, something that can be committed to print. In other words, plays that we now study as masterpieces had been disowned without mention as bastard offspring. But if Venus and Adonis was the first heir of Shakespeare's invention, it seems that Shakespeare also had another heir on his mind, an heir without an heir. Just take in that picture for a little bit. Who do you think it is? It looks a little bit like Queen Elizabeth, doesn't it? Except it was a picture of someone alive in 1592, and this someone at the time was 19, whereas Queen Elizabeth was closer to 65. So both Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece are dedicated to someone named Henry Risley, the Earl of Southampton. Risley was just 19 at the time. There he is. And he was an heir to an earlship and a fortune. He'd inherited both upon the death of his father when he was just a child. By 1592, he was already a notorious figure. He was charismatic, he was strikingly good looking, and most importantly, he was provocatively effeminate in his hairstyle and appearance. He was also something of a wastrel playboy, but not a heterosexual playboy. He preferred the company of men to women. Now, modern scholars pronounce his name, as I just have, Risley. But there's some compelling evidence that Shakespeare and others pronounced his name as Roseley, and that the male admirers of the Earl of Southampton called him Rose for short, an appropriately gender indeterminate name. It's hard not to hear subliminal references to Roseley and the many associations of rose-cheeked Adonis with a beautiful but easily blighted flower throughout Venus and Adonis. Now, Roseley's legal guardian was William Cecil, Queen Elizabeth's senior advisor, spy master, and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. What bad luck. You're a wastrel playboy and you have this guy as your cha-cha, looking over your life, looking over your shoulder. And he's not just a cha-cha, but he's the chief spy master of England. So every step you take, every breath you take, Uncle is watching you. What a downer. And William Cecil was getting increasingly upset about his upstart nephew. In 1592, Cecil resolved to put his foot down. Gossip was circulating about Henry Roseley's habits, and his favourite night haunts in London Strand were not the safest time in a time of plague. So Cecil was determined to discipline the 19-year-old. And like any chacha, his solution, beta, shadi karo. He said, I am going to get you married to the Earl of Oxford's daughter. But young Roseley refused adamantly. And this is a fairly impressive display of will or recklessness, given that the Queen's powerful counselor had ways of getting people to do what he wanted. He was famous for devices of torture, cha-cha from hell. Now, how had Shakespeare come during the pandemic to be dedicating poems to a teenaged rake who refused marriage? Dedications of poetry at this time were not just outbursts of affection. You didn't dedicate a poem to someone because you loved them so much. You dedicated them because they gave you money. Poems, dedications, were carefully composed notes of gratitude to a patron or financial benefactor. And Shakespeare's two dedications for Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece must be read as such. Roseley, or someone perhaps in his family circle, Cecil, the spy master cha-cha, had almost certainly paid Shakespeare to compose two poems. And I'm suspecting it's Cecil, because it seems like Shakespeare had been paid to write poems on a certain subject. The subject being, don't turn away from heterosexual love. It's quite likely too that cha-cha also gave Shakespeare a roof and board outside the city where he tided over the pandemic. So Shakespeare obliged by writing Venus and Adonis, in which the object of Venus's affection is a stunningly handsome boy with the beauty of a girl. Shakespeare's quite explicit about this early on, that Adonis is maiden-cheeked. He's more beautiful than a young girl. Adonis not only refuses the sexual advances of Venus, which is extraordinary. She's the goddess of love, for heaven's sake. And Adonis says, I'll pass on this. I'd rather hang out with my boyfriends, he says. All he wants to do is hunt the boar. In other words, be a wastrel with his young male friends. Shakespeare's dedicatee surely saw himself glamorously reflected in the rosy-cheeked, androgynous Adonis, who is the field's chief flower, sweet above compare, stained to all nymphs, more lovely than a man, more white and red than doves or roses are. You get the theme over and over again, subliminally, rose, rose, rose. You're so beautiful. You can imagine Roseley saying, oh yeah, quite true. Thanks, Shaky. Now, Roseley may have cheered too at Adonis's articulate refusal of union with Venus and his defense of hanging out with his boyfriends. But the message of the poem ultimately bends to the arc of William Cecil Chacha's camp. Adonis is ultimately killed in his pursuit of all male pastimes at the expense of heterosexual love and marriage, which Venus recommends. In a time of pandemic disease, Shakespeare seems to suggest, death comes prematurely to those who do not abide by the imperatives of the social order, even those who are dazzlingly, charismatically at odds with it. Shakespeare's dedicatee must have noted this too, not least because Shakespeare had already told him versions of this in a sequence of poems that would only be published in 1609, but which had been written many years earlier, almost certainly during the 1592 pandemic. Now, Henry Risley is also the leading candidate for the identity of the mysterious fair youth. You may recall that Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, 126 of which are written to and about a fair youth who commands Shakespeare's erotic interest. Now, the fair youth is very much like Henry Risley and very much like Adonis. He's a young man who refuses to get married and is also androgynous. Shakespeare refers to the fair youth famously as master mistress of my passion. Now, the sonnets aren't often taught in India, largely because of the prudishness of the British colonial authorities who cavilled at a frank expression of same-sex love. And unfortunately, that prudishness has been inherited by the curriculum, which, if it offers sonnets to be taught, they tend to be from the Dark Lady sequence, not the Fair Youth sequence. Shakespeare, sounding like any Desi parent, addresses the fair youth as a beta who should settle down and marry, and for one sole reason: so his beauty can be immortalized through a bacha. That motive again seems to have acquired extra urgency in the time of pandemic, when a significant number of Londoners, including young roisterers like Henry Risley, were literally dropping dead with plague. Now, there are uncanny similarities between the Fair Youth sonnets and stanzas from Venus and Adonis. In the latter, we hear Venus ask Adonis, "Is thine own heart to thine own face affected? Can thy right hand seize love upon thy left? Then woo thyself. Be of thyself rejected. Steal thine own freedom and complain on theft. Narcissus so himself forsook and died to kiss his shadow in the brook." So Venus accuses Adonis of being like Narcissus, again, a character from Ovid's Metamorphoses, the young, beautiful boy who falls in love with his own reflection in a pond, spurning the love of the nymph Echo, who has pursued him through the woods. I love the cheeky joke here. Can thy right hand seize love upon thy left? Suggesting that Adonis pleasures himself in ways that, shall we say, the Bible does not accept, in narcissistic fashion. But Shakespeare seems to have remembered this, or to have been inspired by something he wrote in a sonnet to Risley. In the very first sonnet, he says, "To the fair youth, thou, but thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies, thyself thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel." It's exactly the same image of Narcissus falling in love with himself, but also robbing himself by falling in love with himself. And there's even a veiled reference to Narcissus here. Making a famine where abundance lies is a direct quotation from an English translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid had written that Narcissus says, upon looking at his reflection in the pond, in opum me copia fecit, meaning literally, my plenty makes me poor. In English, it was translated as, I make a famine where abundance lies. So once again, it seems like this may have been a common taunt that Shakespeare was throwing at Rose Risley, you're like Narcissus. Please go ahead and make a child. You don't have to fall in love with a woman, just make a child so your beauty can live on. But it's the opening 4 lines of this particular sonnet that are even more evocative of Venus and Adonis. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. But as the reaper should by time decease, his tender air bear his memory. Now, the italicized rose here is often glossed as a reference to romantic poetic convention. You may have heard of the 13th century French narrative poem by Guillaume de Lorry and Jean de Meun called The Romance of the Rose. Scholars will also refer to Petrarch's Italian sonnets, where Petrarch compares his beloved to a rose. Philip Sidney, the sonneteer, had written a sequence of poems called Astrophel and Stella. And Stella, too, is compared to a rose. The big difference is the rose here is not a woman, but a man. But it's not just that Shakespeare is playing with the convention of calling a beloved a rose. He actually italicizes the word and capitalizes it, which indicates it's not just an image, it's a name, a nickname. It's an in-joke, as if the person he is addressing knows, Rose, c'est moi, Mahon. So Rose, I suspect, is Risley. Lurking in the image of the rose, as we've seen, is also the spectre of blasting, blighting, consuming, rotting, death in a time of plague. And roses had certainly acquired explicit associations with plague by 1592. Shakespeare always chooses his words very carefully. And Rose is not just a nickname for Risley. Rose, at the time he's writing, would have immediately evoked associations with the plague. And why? Well, here's one theory. Are you familiar with this nursery rhyme? Ring-a-ring-a rosies. I used to play this when I was a child with other children, dancing in a ring. And as the COVID pandemic began in 2020, Londoners, haunted by the cultural memory of a much earlier pandemic, took to singing this old children's song as they washed and sanitized their hands. You may remember the lyrics. Ring-a-ring-a rosies, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. Now, the story goes that the song, far from being simply a playful ditty to accompany a children's game where everyone falls down and laughs manically, is in fact a veiled reference to the bubonic plague pandemics of the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, there are a large number of online sites that will tell you a ring of rosies is an old euphemism for the festering red and black pustules of bubonic plague. Right? So the ring of roses were the first symptoms of plague, the buboes that they were called, which gave their name to bubonic plague. A pocket full of posies is a pocket full of flowers gathered in what was called a pomander. And a pomander was a collection of flowers that would be put in a little sort of locket, and people would walk around with them sniffing them because they thought that this was the best defense against the plague. They believed plague could be caused, remember, by bad air or miasma. So if you smelt something sweet, then you wouldn't catch the plague. Fat chance of that. Which the song seems to acknowledge, because the next line is a tissue, a tissue. The idea being that even though you're sniffing your pomander, you still get sick, you start sneezing, as people with plague often did. And then we all fall down refers to the sudden death, the suddenness and the widespreadness of death from plague. Now, this is a nice story, but like many stories, it's in fact too good to be true. There's no historical evidence for the song having been either composed or sung during the plague epidemic. The earliest instance of the song is from the 19th century, and it makes no reference to a tissue, we all fall down. These lines seem to have been added as late as the 1950s. Actually, interestingly, after the Hiroshima atomic bomb blast. And so we all fall down might be a reference to that instead, another massive trauma. It's just a wonderful illustration of how fake news works. The story that it dates back to the plague has been repeated so often that it now has assumed the heavy weight of fact. But still, there may be a small kernel of truth to the story. Roses were indeed associated with the plague, but not as metaphors for the buboes of plague, which were black, not red. That's why it was called the Black Death. Instead, roses were associated with the pomander. In fact, a ring of roses was the pomander posy that people would walk around with in order to try and avoid the plague. Roses smelt sweetest of all, so roses were coveted during plague time as a way of banishing the smell of disease. Now, Shakespeare seems to have known that the perfumed sweetness of a rose pomander was no weapon against death. Rich people were falling over dead with their great big rose pomanders. Indeed, he feared sweetness, sweet smells could be a deadly cover for death. And he would, throughout his subsequent work, associate sweet-smelling flowers with hidden danger. Think of Friar Lawrence in Romeo and Juliet. And Romeo and Juliet was one of the first plays Shakespeare wrote after the theatres reopened. We never think of Romeo and Juliet as a post-pandemic play. Now, in the age of COVID, everywhere I look in Romeo and Juliet, I see pandemic panic, everywhere. Sudden death, people being forced to flee the city, all sorts of potions that are doing the rounds that don't work. This is a play immersed in the trauma of the plague pandemic. Now, there's a famous moment in Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet that involves a flower. Flowers are mentioned, by the way, throughout the play. Romeo is himself compared to a rose. He's another fair youth who is incredibly beautiful. So there might be yet another reference to Rose Lee in the character of Romeo. But the character I'm interested in is the friar. He's an avid gardener, and he's also a florist, come apothecary. And he tells us, as he walks on stage with a flower, and I'd like to think it's a rose, within the infant rind of this weak flower, poison hath residence, and medicine power. For this, being smelt, with that part cheers each part. Beautiful rose smell, being tasted, slays all sense with the heart. And where the worser is predominant, full soon the canker death eats up the plant. So we can see here how life, vibrant life, and death are living in close proximity to each other in the figure of the flower, the rose. And this continued to haunt Shakespeare throughout his career. In Macbeth, Lady Macbeth tells her husband, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." And we all know what happens to Ophelia after she's dispensed supposedly medicinal flowers to the court in Elsinore. She dies, and so does pretty much everyone else. Shakespeare associated flowers, roses, with the possibility, the certainty of death. Now, in the sonnets, Shakespeare craftily avoids romanticizing marriage. He never says to the fair youth, find a woman, fall in love with her, enjoy her beauty. He simply presents marriage as a shrewd business proposition. And he describes the childless fair youth as a profitless usurer, as if you're someone who's got all this money, but you're not making profits on it. As if Shakespeare is Rose's asset manager, and he's saying, you're not investing your assets well. You've got beautiful assets, Rosie. Please invest them wisely. And he goes on to say, when nature calls thee to be gone, if you are going to die, what acceptable audit canst thou leave? Meaning, what are you going to leave when you die? Please leave a child who will be as beautiful as you. So this has nothing to do with heterosexuality. It has everything to do with reproducing the beauty of the rose that may at any moment die. Shakespeare is doing what Cha-Cha has asked him to do, trying to persuade Rose to get married, but he's doing it in a way that also says to Rose, you are so beautiful. Forget about marriage as something that involves love. It's just a transaction. All I want is for your beauty to live forever and your children. Now, this suggests how Shakespeare strategically pitched marriage to a young man who is almost certainly not sexually interested in women. But it also shows how thoughts of both making money and persuading Rosalie to do the socially expected thing guided Shakespeare as he wrote the sonnets. Shakespeare was a poet for hire in the time of pandemic. But poverty and social irresponsibility are not the only plague time fears lurking in the sonnets. Shakespeare says in lines that resonate with Venuses and Venus and Adonis, beauties do themselves forsake and die as fast as they see others grow. Rose, you're not going to live forever. And he's not imagining you're going to grow old and wrinkle and shrivel. He's saying you might drop dead tomorrow. And comparing the youth to a summer's day, he says, rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. He says, in your prime, you may be torn apart. Again, I think this is pandemic fear. He's not saying you're going to grow old. He's saying tomorrow, 1 minute from now, you might die. Hence a sense of urgency in the sonnets. In a time of epidemic disease, death is not simply the end point that we all know we'll reach at some point. Death is coming for us. As the sonnets proceed, Shakespeare turns down the volume on his Beta Shadi Karo act. But he doesn't let go of the fear that death might strike at any time. The need to grant everlasting life to the fair youth, who may die now, remains the theme of the sonnets. Eventually, it's not having a baby that will make the fair youth live forever, but Shakespeare's own lines that will lend him immortality. Now, he says, you should live twice, yes, in a baby, but also in my rhyme. Right now, I will make you live forever. Not even Shakespeare could have realized how prophetic these lines would be. The fair youth still lives every time we read the sonnets, which is, when you think about it, an extraordinary paradox because we don't really know the fair youth at all. Apart from this picture, which I'm showing you, Shakespeare doesn't illustrate the fair youth. We never see him. We never see his physical details spelled out. So really what lives is not the fair youth, but rather Shakespeare through his poetry about the fair youth. In other words, what has been immortalized is less the youth than Shakespeare himself. And in particular, what has been immortalized is Shakespeare's own desire to live. What we witness in the sonnet sequence is an astonishing transformation. Shakespeare is guided by a professional imperative to tell a patron's wayward ward to get married so his beauty can live on in his heirs. But then Shakespeare's advice about how to get married to avoid death begins to break apart. Instead, Shakespeare taps into a mounting personal anxiety that he too will die, and that he too must find ways to survive an end that cannot be escaped. Yes, I will die. Yes, I might die tomorrow, but I must somehow survive even though I know I will die. How to do that? Through poetry. Now, there are arguably other traces of the traumatic memory of the pandemic in Shakespeare's plays. And these stage emotional hardships that acquire an extra resonance for us now in the time of COVID. We might think of Romeo and Juliet's depiction not only of young lovers struck down by death, but also of Romeo's sudden exile from the city. He's forced overnight to leave and flee. And we might think of the heart-rending images of migrant laborers queuing up at railway stations and bus stops, trying desperately to get out of town in a hurry to get back to their villages. We might think also of The Merchant of Venice, written in the same year as Romeo and Juliet, and its presentation of the very real threat of the abrupt loss of livelihood to Antonio, but also to Shylock. Overnight, you lose your source of economic security. And we might think most of all of The Taming of the Shrew, another play that seems to have been written in about 1594, 1595. Taming of the Shrew is a play within a play. We often forget this. The first scene involves a bunch of actors coming on stage saying, "We will present The Taming of the Shrew to a lord in his private mansion." It's performed, in other words, by a traveling theatre group, which is in all certainty what Shakespeare and his company had to do themselves as they were fleeing the plague. But it's in the sonnets' fear of death, the desire to live, and in particular, the fantasy of surviving our own death that resonates most for me as the telltale sign of someone who has just lived, who is living through a pandemic. Until last year, we'd forgotten how this cluster of fear, desire, and fantasy, not just Shakespeare's, but also our own, gets activated and augmented in a time of pandemic. Maybe that's one of the reasons why in the COVID-19 year that we've just been through, we've turned so much to poetry. Everywhere, I don't know whether you've noticed, but on social media, in print, people are suddenly reading poetry and writing it. I noticed when I was teaching my first year class that there was a deep interest in poetry that was stronger than I've ever seen before, partly because people are wanting to read it out loud, but wanting to write it themselves. In the poetry we read, voices from the past, dead voices, come alive and speak to us from beyond their graves. In the poetry we write, we live twice, to quote Shakespeare, in ourselves and in our rhyme, or our blank verse, or our ghazals, or our nazms. Shakespeare's response to the pandemic reminds us how poetry clings to the hope that in a world where death has suddenly become much more real and omnipresent, life might somehow continue, not just in us, but also beyond us, in our written words, in our poetic posies. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'll be happy to host questions now.
Thank you, Harris, for such an elaborate discussion and linking up the idea of personal poetry to the historical event of the plague, right? And your focus has been mostly on poetry, as you ended up with as well, because poetry, which is more hard hitting and immediately catching the attention of the people. I was particularly thinking about two articles which were published last year. One was by Emma Smith, I think, in the New Yorker, and the other one was by Stephen Greenblatt. That was in the New York Times, right? So Emma Smith makes an interesting observation by saying that plague, or the so-called epidemic, is everywhere and nowhere in Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
And Greenblatt adds up to this observation by saying, strangely enough, no one dies of the plague in Shakespeare's plays, right? Except for what you made a mention of, Romeo and Juliet, where the tragedy ensues because of the failure of the person. And he was from the Franciscan order, I guess, a priest. And he was to be quarantined. And because of this quarantine, the letter never reaches. And they
Yes.
die. Now, the question here is that today we are talking about Shakespeare as full of potential that draws our attention to the historical event of plague, but you're talking about it today. Why we talk about pandemic and Shakespeare not before the pandemic happened, right? Because we have been reading Shakespeare with the consciousness, we are reading Shakespeare with all historical debates, but we have never spoken about pandemic and Shakespeare or disease and Shakespeare, fine, for so long. However, I am reminded of a very old study on Shakespeare and his imagery, 1935, Caroline Spurgeon, fine. There she makes a list of the images of death and disease, like many others, where Shakespeare had to portray the ethos of the age, right? So my question is that literature, although it has the power to comment upon the history, contemporary history, and perhaps predict a situation which is otherwise emotionally universal, because emotions do not have evolutions. The man who lost his child, let's say 4,000 years back, the kind of emotion he must have felt is the kind of emotion would be felt by someone who is losing his child even today. So, what was the politics of emotion on the part of Shakespeare that he at the same time sidelined the whole idea of pandemic and at the same time included it? Because the best of the Shakespeare's plays, which were written and circulated all over the globe, which were written during the time when they were not getting staged between 90, say, let's say 1603, 1610, and theater historians have recorded that between 1605 and 1610, more or less, I think in aggregate, only 9 months was a period in these 5 years when theaters were open, right? So how did Shakespeare think about his later plays after having written the tragedies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in Macbeth also, there is a displaced notion of a pandemic, fine, the disease is to the king. Then what was the politics of Shakespeare by not provocatively talking about the pandemic, right? Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I think it's a reminder, the fact that Shakespeare doesn't address pandemic and plague explicitly, even though, as Caroline Spurgeon has noted, images of plague are everywhere in Shakespeare, everywhere. But no character other than the one who is referred to in passing in Romeo and Juliet actually dies of plague. And we get that passing reference to quarantine as well. It's a reminder that trauma is that kernel of history that is often visible not in its explicit signifiers, but rather in its absence. And it's very hard to read historically for absences. Right? We are often looking for the explicit out of which to construct Shakespeare's world. But as the German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin once said, the past is never completely past. The past is an orbit around the present. And in a moment of great danger, The past finds its meaning in the present, Benjamin says. And I think it's only in a moment like the moment we are currently in that we can begin to recognize the contours of the trauma that not just Shakespeare, but his audience all collectively participated in. This is something that another German philosopher, Carl Schmitt, talks about, the extent to which history is present in Shakespeare's drama. He's talking specifically about Hamlet, but I think it can be just as much applied to Shakespeare's poetry. History is present as a constitutive absence that nonetheless Shakespeare and his readership or his audience are all in possession of. Right? Everyone reading the poems, hearing the poems, knows about the experience of plague. It takes very little for that memory of plague, the emotional memory, as well as the phenomenological memory, to be triggered by certain structures of representation that put a veil over the trauma. I think there's a way in which we are attentive to that veil now because of what we ourselves are experiencing. Yes, we talk about COVID all the time, but we also spend so much of our time trying not to talk about COVID, trying to find ways of diverting attention. Yet COVID still structures the way in which we interact with each other, even when we're not thinking about COVID or speaking about COVID. It's always there as a structuring absence, an absent presence. Now, as far as Shakespeare's late plays are concerned, and that's a really good point, one that we have too often forgotten, that Shakespeare's business as a playwright was dramatically affected by repeated bouts of the plague in the first decade of the 17th century. And in fact, a lot of Shakespeare's income came not from the theatre, but from dabbling in real estate. This is something that many people think of as a sort of dirty secret, that Shakespeare was, instead of devoting himself selflessly to his art, was trying to flip houses and get profits on them. And this has even been cited as one of the reasons why Shakespeare couldn't have written the plays attributed to Shakespeare, because what we know about the historical man Shakespeare suggests that he was, a dirty capitalist rather than, a man of refined aesthetic sentiment. Why does it have to be either or? Shakespeare clearly was a canny businessman, and he had to be in order to cope with the 1001 shocks to which his and his audience's flesh were heirs as a result of the plague. I think we do see the sort of shadow, the sort of structuring absence of plague in some of the late plays. Greenblatt talks about King Lear, for instance, which clearly demands to be seen as a play. I'd love to see King Lear now after this COVID year. What do we do with our older people when they fall sick in a time of plague and there's no one to take them in? Suddenly, in all the years I've taught King Lear, people have said to me, I can't stand this play because King Lear is so unsympathetic. He's such a nasty old man. And I kind of cheer when he's thrown out in the heath and has to fend for himself. That's what students often say to me. And I can understand that. But I think after the COVID year and after some of the profoundly traumatic images that we've been seeing in the newspaper today of young people weeping on the pavement with a father or an uncle who is dying of COVID but cannot be admitted into a hospital because the hospital doesn't have space to take him in. Now, Goneril and Reagan don't take in Lear because they're being nasty, but still the pathos of having nowhere to go when you're old must have resonated like crazy in a time of plague. So this is something that I would love to see a COVID era production of King Lear. I think the play might speak to us afresh now.
Thank you so much. I think I would, if you allow, I would like to read out a few lines which were spoken by Ross in Macbeth, which exactly describes what we are going through now. Fine. And because you see, this is a play where we normally, generally, we do not try to look at the idea of plague, but it is very much metaphoric presence. The plague that in Macbeth they're talking about is a displacement because he's actually talking about the person who rules. Right? He is very much like a despotic ruler, and because
Yeah.
of that, the entire tragedy is following. However, the lines were like, "Alas, poor country, almost afraid to know itself. It cannot be called our mother, but our own grave, where nothing but who knows nothing is one seen to smile. Where sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air are made not marked. Where violent sorrows seem in modern ecstasy." By the way, modern in Shakespeare's time meant trivial, right? So it's a modern ecstasy. The dead man's knell is there, scarce asked for who, and good men's life expire before the flowers in their caps
Yeah.
die a year they sicken.
And
So
there are the flowers again,
yes,
interestingly.
and these lines now appear so relevant to us that we cannot escape from the immediate influence or the understanding of these. However, questions are coming, so I will read them out for everyone here. So there is a question for Navashri Nandini, and she asks, has there been any work of Shakespeare where he has talked about a relief from the trauma of the pandemic and sort of a positive outlook amid the pandemic, or something that would provide a diversion from the present scenario? Then some lines that signifies such an outlook of Shakespeare. I think it's post-traumatic recovery,
Yeah.
if Shakespeare is commenting upon that. Yeah.
Thank you, Navashri and Navashri Nandini. What's interesting in your question is that positive outlook and diversion are sort of aligned here. Um, and I think for many of us, we try to think positively during this pandemic by diverting our gaze, by looking elsewhere. Because looking straight in front of us has often proved to be so traumatic, as we're seeing again right now with the current surge. What I admire about the sonnets is how honest they are and beautiful, inasmuch as they attempt to see some kind of possibility of living beyond one's own death. And that may not be the redemption or the relief that we want right now. But I personally will take it. That there is a sense that even though death is omnipresent, that something goes on. And we cannot quite predict what that something will be, and who will be the agent of that something continuing to be. Shakespeare couldn't have predicted that his poems would be read, 400 years later, 430 years later, or spoken about in a Zoom seminar in India on the other side of the world. But that is a survival of sorts. It's probably not a relief to people here to think, well, maybe my Zoom chat will 430 years from now be discussed by people in an air bubble on a Martian colony. So I think we have to look elsewhere to find the kind of relief that you seem to be looking for, which is diversion. I've been watching a lot of Netflix this year. I think I've rediscovered my profound pleasure in a good thriller. And there is a way in which a thriller sort of repeats something of the absent structuring logic of the pandemic, because a thriller is presenting us with a clear and present danger, yet there is always the hope that we will arrive at a position of mastery at the end through the work of the detective or the police person. Now, I think that some of Shakespeare's plays do follow that sort of trajectory. And I'm thinking here about Much Ado About Nothing. which is in some ways a beautiful comedy that is an excellent act of disguise, because hidden in the comedy is a terrible tragedy. It's the tragedy of Hero and Claudio, which is in some ways replayed a few years later in the tragedy of Othello. Hero is wrongly accused of being sexually unfaithful to her man, who believes gossip that comes from an evil manipulator. That becomes the story of Othello later, but in Much Ado About Nothing, it's almost a subplot that then gets smoothed over in this sort of beautifully festive environment. And interestingly, there's a detective. There's a character, Dogberry, who is a constable who is charged with working out what has gone on so that Hero could be wrongly accused. Now, Dogberry is a complete idiot, and he doesn't know what he's doing. He can't tell his left from his right, but somehow he blunders into apprehending the actual villain. And that's part of the pleasure of Much Ado About Nothing, that the detective does get it right, that we know that he's wrong as he gets it right, but there's an assurance that somehow we will gain mastery over the problem. We will live to see another day. Everyone will live to see another day. And the source of the trouble, the bastard, Don John, who is described, by the way, as a canker in the hedge. Isn't that an interesting term? As a plague, the plague is banished. So I think Much Ado About Nothing, we could say that nothing is the plague. It is the absence, the nothing that is behind the comedy, the fantasy that we will outlive this and the canker will be banished. So that's where I go if you want the kind of diversion that you seem to be speaking about, Navashri.
Right. That was really provocative response, I should say. Well, just taking a little diversion from a little serious politics about, let's say, pandemic. Last year, during the pandemic, during the first wave worldwide, Zizek wrote a book, and he wrote it within 2 months and this was one of the first books to come on this COVID-19. And in his own stylistic way, he called this as the virus of ideology, right? And later also Novel Harari also echoed the same sentiments. So does Shakespeare, by using the plague, because it's apparent in metaphors and addresses to one character to another, right? Plague. Does he also make his audience aware about the politics of the epidemic?
Now, I was really struck as I was hearing you read out Ross's words, how, yes, we can read them as a veiled reference to plague, but they're also a veiled but not veiled reference to the specter of authoritarianism and totalitarian violence. And I think that's something we can and must recognize. The combination of the pandemic and authoritarianism, which we're living through right now, coalesces affectively for us. The sense of deep foreboding that not only people are disappearing, but institutions are disappearing. Macbeth is very much a play about the entire erosion of a society by a person who becomes a figure of walking death. He represents the malign power of the plague, but he also represents the malign power of an absolutely violent state power against which we feel so frightened and defenseless, we can't name it. I know exactly how Ross feels. And I can say this as an OCI, as a result of legislation that many people don't know was passed last year. If I say anything that explicitly criticizes the government, I stand to lose my OCI status. Now, my reaction to that is different in a COVID year from what it might have been even 2 years ago. Because my sense of losing a voice, losing the reassuring support networks of social institutions that will protect me in the face of relentless violence, that's gone. And I think we're seeing that even more now. I've got to be careful about what I say, I know. But this current surge is not just because a virus has decided to ramp up and attack us with more vehemence. There are all sorts of other factors behind this, not least a certain prioritization of state activity, including in elections in your home state right now. Yes, I think plague can become a metaphor for what is ailing us politically, but it's more than just a metaphor. It's also part of an entire nexus that Shakespeare can help us think about in ways that I think Macbeth is the play for our times right now. I can't state this enough. I'm going to be editing, by the way, an edition of Macbeth. It's something I would have never accepted until this year, because suddenly Macbeth for me is the play of the moment, precisely because it's about the specter of death in a time of authoritarianism.
Thank you so much for this candid response to this, because now it has become, like, as you said, Macbeth is that word that nobody speaks, right? So, as if a king is so much obsessed with sustaining the power while his countrymen are dying. That's what is happening in Macbeth. And
Yes.
it is more than obvious to relate it what's happening in India right now, right? Anyways, there are a number of questions which are coming up. I'll just read. Shalini is asking, during 1593 era, whole world constraints by plague. And civilians claim that plague occur because God gets angry. Is it right way to evaluate pandemic from God? What is your opinion as compared to the present scenario?
So let me not mince words. I think it's one of the laziest forms of thinking to say that an epidemic disease is a result of God wanting to punish. I mean, what kind of God is that to begin with? Secondly, over and over again, this kind of explanation always blames those who are already pretty powerless and singles them out for God's punishment. We saw this during the HIV epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s, which was called the gay plague by homophobic people, certainly in the West, God's punishment against gay people. We saw at the beginning of the COVID epidemic where a minority community was singled out and blamed. They were believed to be both transmitters of disease, but also recipients because they in some way deserved it. I think those who tried to level that accusation should be eating humble pie right now, given what's been happening near the Ganga River and elsewhere. This is not to suggest that any one group is responsible for the pandemic disease. But I think God is a very dangerous figure to invoke in pandemic times. And it's scary to see the extent to which that is still happening right now in ways that collude with forms of majoritarian violence.
Right. We have Murari Prasad with us, and he's asking, do you think Shakespeare was influenced by Boccaccio's collection of stories, The Decameron?
Well, just to fill in some people who may not know, Boccaccio wrote a collection of stories, beautiful collection of stories, the Decameron, which is about a group of Florentines who have escaped the city during plague time and who tell stories to each other as a diversion. And Shakespeare was certainly influenced by Boccaccio. They're stories from Boccaccio that get reworked in the Shakespeare canon. I think the idea of a diversion from trauma is certainly something that we find in Shakespeare. So I've suggested about Much Ado About Nothing. So there's a way in which he's literarily indebted to Boccaccio, and there's probably a way in which he is sort of practically indebted to Boccaccio as a way of just emotionally dealing with the specter of the plague.
So I was thinking whether to ask this question to you or not, but because you prefer the discussion, so I think I should go ahead with it. Year 1609, let's say, for instance, when theaters reopened after a long, long gap, and Shakespeare shifted from Globe to Blackfriars, the theater that he himself bought a year back. So he made a lot of money, even if his plays were not doing good, right? Now, this was a place which was unlike the groundlings of, let's say, the openness and the common people where could come and enjoy Globe. Here was a place where the prices of the tickets were much higher, and it would only cater to one particular moneyed class of the society. And Shakespeare was quite okay with that. So this audience and the theater relationship post 4 or 5 plagues that England had between 20 years, and all of them were devastating. Fine. In fact, Shakespeare himself is plagued. The year he was born, there was a plague, right? A few days later. So he was spared by plague, rather. So 1609, this new relationship, this new dynamics that starts taking place, where there is an enclosure, people can get seated and enjoy plays. How this new arrangement of the theater some way dictated the stage mechanism and the imagination of Shakespeare's plays, later plays, of course.
Yeah.
Fine. So if you would like to comment.
I mean, that is such an interesting question. I puzzled about it often in the pre-COVID time, because of course Shakespeare's plays continued to be performed in the Globe. He now had the option of this extra indoor theatre. And as you say, it came with a much more elite audience. I think that one thing that certainly attracted him to the Blackfriars may have had nothing to do with its elite clientele. Yes, it's tempting to think that this was social distancing, the 1609 style, that moving indoors took him away from the so-called great unwashed in the Globe Theatre, though he certainly continued to practice there as well. But I think that what the indoor theatre allowed him to do was deploy new forms of theatre technology that couldn't be used outside. And in particular, these included effects of light and sound. And one thing we find in the plays from 1609 onwards are scenes that require much more special effects. They may seem fairly pedestrian by our standards. They're not IMAX theater type three-dimensional special effects. But in Pericles, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, you have shipwrecks. The first scene of The Tempest, you actually have a ship on stage that is going down. How do you stage that? Outdoors, it's going to look fairly embarrassing if there are a bunch of people sort of running around having pails of water thrown at them by stagehands. But in an indoor theater, which is dark, where you can illuminate very briefly the stage using fireworks to simulate the effect of lightning. You can create acoustic effects using, for instance, wobbled sheets of metal that sound both like a thunderclap and something eerie, like spirits driving a ship to shore. I think Shakespeare was very attracted to that. Even Macbeth, which was written before the Blackfriars opened, but it was certainly performed at court for King James. That play starts with thunder and lightning. And I suspect that stage direction was for an indoor performance where they would have detonated firecrackers. And it's important that smell of firecrackers would have included a hint of sulfur. And of course, the gunpowder plot, which had just been unveiled and which had threatened to blow the House of Parliament with King James in it sky high. The gunpowder plot was fresh not only in the memories, but also the nostrils of Shakespeare's audience. So putting them in an enclosed space and detonating squibs that smelt of sulfur and gunpowder was a very sneaky way of reminding the audience of the gunpowder plot. But I wonder if the experience of thunder and lightning in the court, the indoor court, made Shakespeare long for an indoor theatre where he could use more of these special effects, which culminated in plays like Pericles, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, where he was able to unleash the full arsenal. So I'm not sure that has to do with the pandemic. I think it has probably more to do with sort of creating intensities of experience in the theatre that had not been experienced hitherto.
So currently, I don't think we have any questions coming our way. So it was wonderful actually talking to you, because in the last response that the special effects we are talking about, well, let's go back 15 years back when he was writing, let's say, play like Twelfth Night. In the beginning of Twelfth Night also, there is a shipwreck, but that's reported.
Yes.
The shipwreck is reported, Act 1, Scene 2, I guess. And often we read that as the opening scene for our convenience, but it's never staged, right? Anyways, it begins with the intense poetry, fine, intense poetry. So I think that would be all. I thank you on behalf of each and every colleague of mine and all those who are here today for coming and celebrating with us Shakespeare's birthday. That was our first Shakespeare series lecture annual, and we hope to continue it in the coming years as well. We thank you, Professor Gil Harris, for coming and delivering such a wonderful talk and engaging with us in such warm discussion. And I wish everyone a safety and a healthy life ahead, and may we all soon come out of this pandemic situation, but never out of Shakespeare. So, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. It's good to see so many of you here and some familiar faces too from Ashoka University. Thank you for coming. And I wish you to all safety from pandemic and from the other things that Macbeth warns us against. So all the best to all of us.
Thank you.